Thank you. I'm not really a comedian, but of course the real joke is in Washington, D.C. And it's funny how liberals actually vote for real clowns. You know, it's amazing, much more than the Republicans do. So anyway, I don't know how I kind of fell into this. My brothers and I are musicians. We got real lucky because we were unique. I mean, how many four-brother trumpet players are there in the world, right? So I can proudly say I think we became the most famous four-brother trumpet group in the world, and probably the only four-brother trumpet group in the world. But that led to some Tonight Show appearances, and I got to meet President Ronald Reagan. We got to perform at the in Washington, D.C. for Christmas in Washington back before you folks were born in the 80s. Barbara Mandrell introduced us. So anyway, a few years ago, I was watching Fox News one too many times, and you know how they mention the Constitution occasionally, just occasionally. And I thought, boy, I don't know if I've read that document all the way through. I better do it. And so I started. And what a painful experience. I couldn't, oh my gosh, it's like, how do you understand this? How do you apply it? What doesn't make sense? And then I got to Article 2, Section 1, last paragraph, and that's the President's oath. And we all know what it is, and I knew what it was, generally, but when I looked at it in the Constitution. How many of you have a copy of the Constitution with you? Raise your hand. I have a copy. I have copies that I can give you. So maybe if you want to refer to it while I'm talking. Okay, it's interesting because this copy of the Constitution was actually compiled by Ronald M. Mann. And Ronald M. Mann is the person that has endorsed my 7 discoveries everyone should know in the U.S. Constitution: power to fund government without taxation, or power to fund the USA without taxation. That sounds like a joke, but it's not. The joke is what's going on right now, and I'll get into that in a minute. But so Ron Mann was deputy director of the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution back in the 80s under President Ronald Reagan. And so he initiated the distribution of this compiled Constitution that you have, and he told me that he got it to 52 million people, or at least 52 million copies were distributed throughout the United States. And then Cleon Skousen with the NCCS now have distributed 12 million copies. So that's 64 million copies. And one of the feathers in my cap is I've made 3 corrections in their Constitution booklet. So I'm thinking, hey, after 64 million copies, maybe someone ought to proofread it. So, which I did with the index when I was putting mine together. I found 3 typographical errors. You know, nothing big, but they're there. So anyway, so I felt guilty, and I'm reading the Constitution and get to that Article 2, Section 1, last paragraph, and read the President's oath, and it just blew my mind because I had just heard President Obama publicly declare to the world on national television that he felt the Constitution was fundamentally flawed. Well, we know that's not true. We know what's fundamentally flawed, and it's not the Constitution. It's his understanding of it. And so that motivated me to keep studying, and I started finding nuggets within the Constitution. And then I became friends with Stephen Pratt, who wrote the foreword to the 5,000-Year Leap, and videotaped him for many hours. And I have 6 hours of videos that I'm going to release of him before he passed away. And so I've been able to research the document itself and then have access to people like Stephen Pratt and others who have PhDs in constitutional law. And I found that the Constitution hasn't really been studied like it should have been. What has been studied is the history leading up to it. But the actual document, as I continued to study, came alive, and I saw the battle. I saw the battle going on between good and evil. And so to put it in a nutshell, I found these, what I thought were discoveries that everyone knew, that I thought were quite provocative and relevant and unique. And so I started searching to see if anyone else had found them on the internet. And I couldn't find anyone. So I had a chance to meet with Zelda Nelson, who's the owner of the NCCS, the 12 million that they have distributed. And I presented the concept. I said, Zeldin, I think I've found something that no one else has ever published, as far as I can tell, before in the Constitution. And he was kind enough to spend a half hour with me. And I explained to him, I said, in a nutshell, I said, I think I found that Amendments 5, 9, and even 13 nullify, amend out of existence what I call the locks of the Constitution that make it so darn difficult to understand, because it really is contradictory unless we understand this. I said, Amendments 5, 9, and 13, I have found, nullify the gold and silver clause, the borrowing clause, and the tax clauses within the 7 articles. Now, in order to understand that, we need to know that the Constitution is a contract. And when you have a contract, you have amendments or addendums that change the contract, that fix the contract. The first 10 amendments, a lot of people don't realize, were identified by Congress as further declaratory and restrictive clauses to the Constitution. And as you know, Rhode Island, I think it was, wouldn't sign on to the 7 articles until those first 10 amendments were in place. And the battle, to me, that I was seeing was with the framing of the Constitution, was the battle between the bankers and people who wanted to be free financially. And the bankers, up until that time, had been creating money and loaning it to governments, central bankers. And Abraham Lincoln experienced that situation. He was out of money, as I'm sure many of you know. He was out of money to fund his soldiers for the Civil War. And his choices were so limited, he either had to borrow money from banks at 30 to 37% interest, or listen to Colonel Dick Taylor, his advisor, to go to Congress and constitutionally create paper money, which they did. So he created 450 million United States dollars, funded the Civil War, won the Civil War. Now this is interesting because the South was funded. They were funded by the bankers, England. They were getting funds, they were getting money to fund the Civil War that way. So this goes back to my book, 7 Discoveries Everyone Should Know, and How to Fund Government Without Taxation. Mitt Romney, I was at an event a couple of months ago, and he scared the daylights out of everyone. He said, we're fast approaching $1 trillion interest-only debt. And this is crazy. And I'm thinking, oh, wait a second, Mitt. The Federal Reserve is a non-profit entity. They're a privately owned entity, but they're supposed to return all the profits over and above their operating expenses to the U.S. Treasury. So how could we possibly be, even though the debt's crazy and spending's out of control and crazy and unconstitutional, how could we be responsible for that interest? And so previous to that, I had a chance to talk to Senator Orrin Hatch, because it's so fun. I mean, if you're ever going to run for office, run for U.S. Senate. That's the funnest. If you've never run before, just jump in as a U.S. Senate candidate. I did that in 2012, and I just did it. And so I had a chance in 2012 to visit with Orrin Hatch. And I said, Senator Hatch, I don't think the Federal Reserve is returning the principal. When they create $1 trillion and loan $1 trillion to Congress, and Congress taxes us, and they get money back, and it goes to the Federal Reserve, they're supposed to return the principal and the interest, everything above their operating expenses. And he looked at me and he said, they're not even returning the interest. So I was validated. It's like, we are living in the frickin' twilight zone. It's unbelievable. A nonprofit system. So actually, if they were obeying the law, we would have no taxation, no need for taxation, we would have no federal debt. If they were just following the rules, the laws that guide nonprofit entities. So a few summers ago, I was able to meet with Congressman Grayson. Congressman Grayson is known as a vile, liberal, horrible, awful human being. But he's famous for his videos on the internet that show him interviewing officers of the Federal Reserve. And some of his questions are like, hey, $9 trillion and you can't account for that? And you can't tell us where the $9 trillion went? And then he refers to the Constitution, where you cannot take money from the Treasury and give it out without congressional approval, basically. And I think it was Ben Bernanke said to him, oh, this money isn't coming from the Treasury. And it's like a little crack in their shield that protects these bandits. Article 1, Section 8 gives the Congress the power to protect us from counterfeiters. And what they have done is just the opposite. They are protecting the counterfeiters from us. They're actually doing opposite of what they should be doing. So the Federal Reserve, because it is a privately owned entity, and they loan trillions of dollars, And every time they create a trillion through their complicated economic system kinds of ways, it's pure profit before interest. Before interest, it's pure profit. It's unbelievable. So here we are thinking, oh my gosh, we need taxes and we've got to reduce the federal debt and we've, all this stuff. And this horrible nonsense is going on. How many people in this country realize, first of all, that the Federal Reserve System is a privately owned system? And if you think about it, it's like the emperor's new clothes. If you think about it, if our government, if some miracle happened that we were able to pay off our federal debt and the economy grows and the population grows, we need more money injected into the economy to satisfy the extreme needs of exchanging goods and services. And the only way that can happen in our current system is borrowing it. Our money is borrowed into existence. So under the current system, it is impossible, totally impossible for this country to get out of debt, no matter how prosperous we are. And I think it's an accident that these central bankers have become so successful. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act happened, and a few group of bankers got together, and the other bankers had to be pushed out of the business, and they became the exclusive controllers of this monopoly. And they were on the gold and silver standard. A lot of people think that we were on the gold standard. No, we've never been on the gold standard. The Federal Reserve, the privately owned Federal Reserve, had a bunch of gold, and they were loaning us their paper notes, their paper dollars, and backing it with gold. But thanks to President Nixon and the Congress in the 70s, they eliminated that, and so every dollar that's in existence or has been printed, Federal Reserve note dollar, was first or is now the property, the pure property of the Federal Reserve System, the Rothschilds and other central bankers. So it's crazy. I'm LDS. I went on a mission in 1975 to 77. I got to stay an extra month. And so I've tried to find scriptures. There's scriptures in Isaiah. There's scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants. There's one favorite scripture I have for those of you who can relate to this. And that's D&C 117, last verse, last line, right out of the blue. The Lord tells the prophet Joseph Smith, remember to overthrow the money changers in mine own due time, saith the Lord, even so, amen. So I believe there is a movement happening. I have a friend, his name is Bill Still, and he's probably the most watched documentary in the world, and that is called The Money Masters. And he shows the history of money and talks about the Federal Reserve. And so I think that there is a movement happening where people are becoming more awake and more concerned, and the Audit the Fed movement is growing as well. So this is actually my third Constitution book, and I say it makes all other Constitution books obsolete. And I'll get into that right now, I think. So if you read the 7 articles of the Constitution and read the first 10 amendments or read the 27 amendments, I think the general feeling of people, even scholars that we respect, that believe that it's an inspired document, they tend to communicate that every single clause within the 7 articles is divine and inspired. Well, if that's true, then we can be taxed to death. We can literally all be taxed to death. I don't think that's inspired. So when I was studying the Constitution, I would think about the borrowing clause, the gold and silver clause, and the tax clauses, and I would think that really gets in people's way of understanding the document and understanding the proper constitutional way of issuing money. And so I realized that the central bankers lost because we have the 10 amendments that corrected those clauses that enslave us financially. But they win from our ignorance. So I see the document as, if we study it and understand it as a people, we can defend our inheritance. We can defend our economic freedom. But if we don't study it, then these people in Washington, D.C. can pull the wool completely over our eyes and make us think, like today, we hear, okay, death and taxes, 2 inevitable things in this life, right? Well, really? Well, we know death is pretty inevitable, but taxes? No, that's not true. So once we realize that we can be free from taxation and have a currency that is created not from debt, but from the constitutional way it was intended, we can have a tax-free system, and the value of the dollar could be protected by constitutional spending only. And I've told liberal friends that I've visited with, and I say, the less taxation there is, the more productivity there is. And you've heard the saying that taxation is the power to destroy. The power to tax is the power to destroy. Well, I guess you could say, if you look at the percentage rate of taxation, you could say, well, that's the percentage rate of destruction that's happening. And if we can get it down to zero, we would have an incredible economic revolution, an industrial revolution like this world has never seen. So I'm just blindly kind of going through doors as they open up, looking for opportunities. So I'm excited that Ron Mann has endorsed my book. Not only has he endorsed it, but he's helping me with a project to get the Constitution to every single home in the United States through a magazine. My magazine, my patent attorney told me that I just received the issuance of my trademark, Every Home in America. It had been pending, and now it's for real. So meetings have already started this week where we're meeting with some high-profile people, and we're simply going to get 100 sponsors. They'll each get a space in this magazine, and the cost is only 0.7 of a penny per mail delivery, and that comes out to $1 million, actually $1 million per sponsor. And the launch date is 2019, around July, to get 100 and, well, I'll tell you the breakdown here, reaching the entire country. Homes, 91,394,757. Apartments, 31,837,671. Trailers, 1,403,708. Post office boxes, 8,924,530. Businesses, 3,014,376. The total distribution of this would be 136,575,042, with the message that, hey folks, let's start reading the Constitution and see how absolutely brilliant and futuristic it is. Jefferson said the only corrective, the best corrective of constitutional power abuse is education. So that's my plan. And that's one, sure, you have a question? Sure, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say every home, but have you thought about targeting schools too?
That will be too. Once this is launched, this will be on national, international news. This will be the #1 most widely distributed magazine in the country right now, I think, is ARP. And I think second is Better Homes and Gardens. ARP, yeah. And Better Homes and Gardens, I think, is 7 million. So this is 130 million more than practically, or more than 100 million more than the most distributed magazine in the country. And the thing that's exciting, have you heard of Hometown Values magazine? You get a copy in the mail every month? Those people are great. I'm working with the director of that and the director of the newspaper agency on this project, and they put some of their resources into this for me. They're helping me with this. They distribute 500,000 of those for free every month, and it's just coupons. So this is kind of a similar idea, only this will have content along with the coupons. And we want the coupons to be really good. So it's like food or lodging, hotels, whatever like that. So I feel like this is an opportunity to remember, to learn, to understand, and starting this little fire. This is the first time I've been invited to speak other than running for U.S. Senate. And I'm glad that Delane and you guys saw me, so I had a chance to do this. My brother's here videotaping. What? What?
Interpretation clause.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah, if you have any questions, just blurt them out. Okay, so let me give you an example of some of my discoveries, or one of my favorite discoveries. I was at an event, and I think Tim Ballard was there as well, but I was just in front of someone's booth and talking to people as they walked past, and I would stop them and I would say, "Hi, my name is Lloyd Brunson, and I've discovered something revolutionary within the Constitution that has been overlooked for probably 2 centuries. And this one gentleman looked at me kind of like, okay, who am I talking to? And he pulled out his copy of the Constitution, which is what I just gave out. And he says, you think you can tell me something I haven't heard before? And it was all marked up and used, and you could see that he was a studier. And I said, yes, one of my discoveries. And I said, I'm pretty sure it's a true discovery because I've checked it with the NCCS. They're the ones that publish that Constitution you have. And they told me my discoveries are real. They're legitimate. And I said, this one discovery that I'm excited about is I have found the interpretation clause in that wonderful contract we call the Constitution. Now, we are governed by interpretation. And I have found the clause that demands the Constitution only be interpreted in ways that protect our God-given rights. And he says, let's hear it. I said, it's the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is just one sentence. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And what are those others retained by the people? The Declaration of Independence, penned partially by Thomas Jefferson, tells us it is a self-evident truth. It's declared as a self-evident truth that our rights come from God, and because they come from God, they are permanent, they are unalienable. And so he looked at me, and his jaw kind of dropped a little bit, and he pulled out his wallet, handed me a 10, took my book and walked off. I thought, all right, not only can I share this message, but I can make money to buy more books as well. So I had a great day that day. I took in about $300 talking to people like that. So it's so exciting to have something, and I'm waiting for someone to disprove what I have, and that's what I do. I challenge people, hey, tell me if I'm wrong. Let me know. I want to see. But it just kind of is snowballing, and people are getting involved to get this message out. So the Constitution is absolutely mind-bogglingly brilliant. I look at the Constitution now as a contract of 7 articles and as those first 10 amendments that changed or corrected those first 7 articles. I look at it as a chess match. It's almost like watching an old TV program where you see one guy has the angel on his shoulder and the other guy has the devil on his shoulder. And I see that's what was happening. Alexander Hamilton said a national debt is a national blessing. Brilliant man, I'm sure a good man. But he didn't believe the people, or he didn't understand the difference between a government issuing money and a bank. It seems like they were confused because he tried to create a bank, did sort of a quasi-United States bank and a privately owned bank. They have got to be separate. If we understand the Constitution, banking and the issuing of money are two completely separate things. And so he's saying a national debt is a national blessing. And then Jefferson, too bad he wasn't around when the Constitution was signed, but he said, if that borrowing clause is inserted within the 7 articles, it will destroy this country. And he was right. But it was fixed because the Fifth Amendment, and I remember reading the Fifth Amendment for the first time, really studying it. The last line, it's almost like a cereal box, you know? You get excited when you're a kid about, hey, Mom, come on, fill this out. I want to get the prize. I want to win the big, big prize. Please help me. And then she goes, I'm going to read this first. She reads the contract. It's like reading the 7 articles. And then she reads the amendment, the fine print, the amendments, the fine print at the bottom of the box. Not legal in the state of Utah or your state. It's like, oh, darn. And that's how brilliant the Fifth Amendment, just one little line at the end. You cannot have your private property taken from you for public use without just compensation. What's taxation if it isn't that? If it isn't having your private property taken from you for public use without just compensation. And our politicians and our agencies of government have convinced most of us to believe that, oh, that's public eminent domain. It's like, excuse me? Read it again. You cannot have your private property taken from you for public use. Well, you know, I think it goes beyond that. Public use is not just compensation, and that's the argument that they like to say. As you get the public use, it's like, well, compare it to eminent domain. When they take your land, you get reimbursed for it. And you still get public access to it. It's still public use. So there's a real contradiction there. So I've had a chance to, I get these crazy ideas, and I get on the phone and I call Congressman Grayson's office. Back to Congressman Grayson, this liberal, nasty, horrible human being that criticizes conservatives and all the time. And I got to his office secretary on the phone, and I said, I'm Lloyd Brunson, and I have a video that I presented to 4,000 Utah State delegates in 2012, showing a video of him talking to Ben Bernanke. And I'm a Republican, and he's a Democrat, and I would like to meet with him. I would like to know if he would consider meeting with Mike Lee about the Federal Reserve, the three of us. And they called me back the next day. He agreed to a meeting. He agreed to meet with Mike Lee, who's considered at the time, and probably now, as the most conservative man on Capitol Hill. And so I called his office excitedly, and I said, hey, Congressman Grayson has agreed to meet with us if Mike Lee will consent to a meeting in Mike Lee's office. And they got back to me and said, yes, we're on. So I flew to Washington, D.C., thinking, I'm just a dumb musician, but I found something, and I think maybe we can find common ground with the liberals, some of them, and with the conservatives, and this could be a start. And so I flew in the day before, and the next morning I went into Senator Lee's office, and it was kind of weird. They said, we're not so sure Mike can meet with you because he's got so much going on. And I'm thinking, well, I just flew in for this meeting. And they said, but we'll try to get him to come in. And so finally, sitting there for a while with one of his interns talking about my project and how they have agreed to help me with it, finally, Senator Lee came in. He says, I only have like 4 or 5 minutes. I'll visit with you. And we visited for a little bit, and then he left. And I'm thinking, where's Congressman Grayson? What a flake. Okay, there we go, the liberal flake, right? And so I left the meeting, and I thought, I'll just call and find out why he didn't show up. I thought, no, I'm real close to his office. I will go over to his office. So I went to one of the House buildings, walked in there, found his office, and the person at the front desk, it was unusual because most people at the front desk will tell you, oh, he's not in or she's not in, and we don't know when he will be. They're not the scheduling people. But this person happened to be the scheduler as well. And I said, my name is Lloyd Brunson. I just came from a meeting with Senator Lee, and we had an appointment with Congressman Grayson, and we didn't see him. He didn't make it. And she looked at me, and she said, what? She says, you just met with Senator Lee? I says, yes. And she said, they called us yesterday and canceled the meeting. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. And so she says, just a minute. And so she walked away for a couple of minutes, and she came back, and she says, we are so sorry, and we are upset that this happened. We're going to call over there and see what happened. But Congressman Grayson has agreed to take his lunch break with you for a half hour. So I spent a half hour that was so fascinating about what I'm doing, my project, and the Federal Reserve. I couldn't believe some of the things that he told me. He told me that President Obama and he and others had actually decided, because of federal statutes, they couldn't do it with paper money, they couldn't do it with gold coins, they could not do it with silver coins, but because of federal statutes having to do with coinage, that where the U.S. Mint can coin a coin, and the value of the coin in metal in relationship to the face value can actually go from off budget to on budget profit for the Treasury. And so what they had concocted was actually constitutional, but in the wrong hands. And I'm glad it was stopped, because it would have been in the wrong hands. What they had done was to decide to coin a platinum coin, because platinum has not been regulated yet under those laws. They decided to coin a $1 trillion platinum coin. Any of you ever hear about that? You can Google it and find out about it. And so it was so interesting. So he's telling me, so Congressman Grayson's telling me the story. And he said, you know what? We thought this through, but we weren't sure exactly, once it was coined, what to do with it. We weren't sure who to give it to. And I'm thinking, you kidding me? Give it to an IRS agent. But maybe he had a point. Give it to the Treasury, because it could end up back to the Federal Reserve, right? I don't know. I still don't understand why he was having a problem with that. So he said, but we couldn't complete this plan with this coin because we were stopped by the chair of the Federal Reserve and the Secretary of the Treasury. So Obama was stopped, thankfully, by the chair of the Federal Reserve and the Secretary of Treasury. But the idea was good if it had been in the right hands. But thankfully, it was not implemented. And that was an attempt to overcome the debt ceiling and having to close down the government. And so they were kind of on the verge of doing something that was constitutional, but they were stopped. And of course, the spending of it would have been completely unconstitutional, the way they would have wanted to distribute it. So this whole thing is just like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And so he said to me, he said, Lloyd, there are people walking around on this planet with $1 trillion plus portfolios. They are buying up every big ticket item they can buy on this planet. And a lot of it is going on in the US because they have unfettered, unlimited access to the unlimited ability to create money. Isn't it odd that we hear on the news all the time about the debt? It's getting so big. And I've written a parody, a 19-ton parody. 21 trillion, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. Taxes and interest from shore to shore. The Federal Reserve is the company store, or the biblical. Anyway, I won't say it. So it's just mind-boggling. So he suggested, he says, get a group of people together and bring a lawsuit against the Fed for violating their nonprofit status. And it's like, no, I'm just an idiot musician. Why haven't we seen this? Why haven't we seen some of this information out there? If my brother had not handed me that video, The Money Masters, and if I hadn't understood the history of money, just a little bit, the history of money and what paper money is, I would not have understood the Constitution when I read it because of those contradictions, and understood that the Congress has the power to create money. And you see these ads. If you watch Fox News, you see a ton of ads all the time saying, hey, the paper money, it's worthless. It's not backed by anything. So give it to us and we'll give you our gold. It's like, wait a second, if it's worthless, why do you want to give me your gold for it? And so if you think about it, and there's a short story about Benjamin Franklin, how the colonies had no taxation at a certain period of time, and they had no unemployment. And they were wise about how they issued it. And one of the ways they issued money was they loaned it to property owners. That was one of the ways the government issued it. And if it were to happen today, property owners could receive loans, and then the property owners could then take that money and start banks with it. And then you have a separation of the banks where they're loaning the money that they did earn or borrowed properly, but did not create out of thin air. And then you've got the Constitution and the government where they would have to be very carefully controlled in the way they would issue the money properly. And then you could use the necessary and proper clause the way it should be used instead of the fouled up way that it's used today. So to demonstrate this paper money question, I called the Bureau of Engraving and Printing on the phone a few summers ago. Now there are 3 organizations that create money. There's the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, they create paper money. There's the US Mint, they create coins. And there's the Federal Reserve, they create the digital money. But it all ends up, except for the coins, really as property and profit for the Federal Reserve System, which is privately owned. Sure, go ahead.
What's digital money?
Digital money would be a wire transfer. If the Federal Reserve decides to wire transfer $1 trillion to your personal account, they can do it. And that is considered by the banking industry and according to laws in Congress as newly created pure money. Money, but it's not, because we are backing it up with everything we have. If you think about it, when we have a US currency and it's legal tender, and it's all backed up by us. It is backed up by everything we have. The values fluctuate based on our goods and services and our property that we own. So, did you have a question? Oh, you.
Oh, I was just flashing my digital money.
Okay, right. So digital money, so the problem is this money system, in my mind, it's proven that it works. The Federal Reserve has proven that the monetary system works, but it's in the wrong hands. If it were in the right hands, or if they were following the laws and living up to their nonprofit status, all the money would be returned to the Treasury, and there would be no debt. And then the government could issue money properly through the Federal Reserve if it were really federal. So I say to people, I say, we don't need to destroy or get rid of the Fed. Let's just make it federal. And let's just clean house, get rid of those people, and confiscate all the assets that have been acquired through fractional banking and through the creation of money out of thin air. Just completely confiscate all of the assets from people that didn't properly earn that and return that to the taxpayer. So my second book shows a plan of beginning to return your taxes to you. And that's what should be happened with penalties and interest, is all of our taxes should be returned to us. So anyway, how long have I gone? And I know I could go on forever, and I don't want to.
5 more minutes.
Okay, why don't I just open it up to any questions you might have. I have some copies of my book here. If you'd like to have one, people are giving me $10 a piece for them, but if you don't have cash with you, I take credit cards too. Whatever you might have, I want you to have a book to help cover the printing. That'd be fine. So any questions or thoughts or tomatoes?
So this is maybe off the subject, but
That's okay, it can be off the
this whole
subject.
Bitcoin craze, you know.
Bitcoin is not a currency. Bitcoin is a voluntary, it's like a Sears dollar. Or, you know, it's a voluntary kind of a thing. I don't trust it, but I mean, if it were controlled by the right people. So a true currency is something that is declared legal tender by the US government. So that is not a currency.
I just read recently about a plan that on the 1st of July of this year, these international bankers are going to be coming up with a new global currency.
Oh, they always are. They're always trying to come up with something. I think they're just completely drunk with their wealth. I don't think they're that organized, actually. And I think it's a drug. You know, the more you get, the more you have to have, and you just can't stop. It's like socialism. Socialism, once it devours all of the producers, what's going to happen? If socialism were allowed to go out of control, what would it do? They would then devour themselves. And then the last ones remaining would kill each other. I mean, it's just so crazy. It's like, where's the logic? Okay, I just want to talk real quick. Oh, go ahead.
What about President Trump? Is he interested in trying to get into the
My second book, I was invited to go to Washington, D.C. and meet with a PAC called Freedom Works. And Stephen Moore was there. Stephen Moore was at the time President Trump's chief economics advisor. And I gave him 2 books. And he said he would personally hand one to Donald Trump. And I saw something on Fox News with Sean Hannity that makes me believe that he possibly got it, because Sean started talking about a conversation he had with the president about his concept that I had in my book that I thought was kind of unique, and I want to check into that. But anyway, so I'm going to, that's part of my plan, is at some point, these books are just hot off the press. I've only done a few hundred of them, only had them for just a short period of time. So that's part of my plan, is get them to the right people and start the dialogue going. I think some of our representatives, Mia Love, I gave her one a few weeks ago, and a few others. But it's so, I mean, it really looks crazy to people. It's like power to fund the government without taxation. It's like, you know, we are so in the dark. We are so brainwashed and not understanding the proper issuing of money and where money comes from, that it just, people kind of scoff at the idea. But we got a fire going with magazine and other options. We'll get this thing going. But real quick, am I out of time? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is not just about arms. It's about education. Because the Second Amendment, if you tie it to Article 1, Section 8, the militia clause in Article 1, Section 8, it states that the purpose for the militia that's voluntary is to execute the laws of the Union. And what is the laws of the Union? It's the Constitution of the United States. And the Congress has the power to fund, to raise money, to discipline the militia. Discipline is education. Congress also has the power to fund and supply all of the members of the militia with arms. So I say, I am for gun control. I am a very strict proponent of strict gun control. Anyone that is an enemy, a progressive, a liberal Democrat, or a progressive, or someone who is an enemy of the United States Constitution, they should not be allowed to own firearms. That's what I think. And those protectors and defenders of the Constitution should not only be allowed to own firearms, but they should be allowed the opportunity to be armed and to be disciplined, trained in the use of any military-grade weapon that they can safely and competently store and use. That is the Second amendment. So, anyway, thank you. Any more questions, or thank you very much.